I kept the kennel logs at HFY station for 6 years, before anyone above my pay grade bothered to learn my name. To the Hunter Corps, I was just the feeder. I never minded it. Watering and feeding 11 Apex-class hunters twice a day, hosing down the run, patching the mesh where the younger ones tested their claws. That was honest, repeatable work, and nobody ever shouted at me for doing it wrong. I liked things I could do right. Pharaoh was the 12th. Designate Unit Pharaoh 9, Vorin Line, the largest combat class Apex the Corps had ever grown out of a vat, armor plates the color of wet slate running the length of a spine as long as a cargo sled, jaws that could shear docking plating, 4 eyes that tracked every motion in the run at once. Except mine, somehow. I'd wheel the feed cart past his gate, and he'd just watch, low to the ground, still. The way a man watches weather he isn't sure is coming for him. I never worked him like the others. I didn't drill him, didn't run him through the obedience gates, didn't wave a baton at him to make him sit. I just fed him on time, talked to him about nothing. Weather reports off the relay station, how the mesh needed patching again, whatever, and left. Pharaoh started meeting me at the gate, before the cart even rolled into view. That was the whole relationship. I never called it a bond. The Corps would have had a word for it that made it sound like a malfunction. The other handlers ran their hunters on a point system. Obedience scored, aggression scored, kill efficiency scored, all of it logged and posted to a board in the muster room like a sports ladder. Pharaoh sat at the bottom of that ladder for 2 straight quarters, not because he was slow or weak, but because he wouldn't perform for an audience. Put a review officer in the gallery and he'd go still as a statue, refusing every command until the officer left, and only then would he run the course clean, alone, like the whole point was doing the work rather than being seen doing it. I understood that better than most people at Kesh. I'd rather patch a mesh panel nobody notices than get thanked for one everybody watched me fix. Then came the raid on the Hollow Creek settlements, and a hunter named Skelt broke formation mid-cull to shield 3 colonist children the strike had flagged as acceptable loss. Skelt went dark rather than finish the order. Command called it defection. They sent Pharaoh in to put him down. Pharaoh was the strongest, the cleanest kill record in the Corps, the one nobody argued with. Pharaoh found Skelt, and Pharaoh didn't finish the order either. He came back to the run 3 days later, with a torn ear, and Command's fury waiting for him. I never got the full story of what happened out there, only pieces from the strike team's own chatter, that Pharaoh had caught up with Skelt at a canyon crossing, that the 2 of them had stood off against each other for the better part of an hour, while the rest of the team called in for instructions nobody answered fast enough, and that when Pharaoh finally moved, it wasn't toward Skelt. He put himself in the gap between Skelt and the strike team's guns, and simply refused to leave it, the same stubborn, immovable posture I'd only ever seen him use with feed carts and mesh repairs. Command called it a malfunction in the field report. I never believed that word applied to anything Pharaoh did on purpose. Warden-Marshal Austin Drace, who ran the Corps out of Kesh with the patience of a man counting bullets, didn't care about reasons. He cared about precedent. A hunter that refused an order once could refuse it again, and a Corps full of hunters, who thought for themselves, wasn't a Corps he could sell to the colony boards, who paid the Corps' budget precisely because they'd been promised predictable, obedient monsters and nothing more. Pharaoh was reclassified, compromised asset, scheduled for termination at the next public review, out on the docking concourse, in front of the colonists Command wanted reassured. I found out from the roster the same way I found out about feed schedules, pinned to the board outside the run, no explanation, just a time and a unit number. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't misreading someone else's beast. I went and sat by his gate that night anyway, same as any other night. Pharaoh pressed his head against the mesh, slow, like it cost him something. I didn't have anything smart to say. I told him the mesh needed patching again. He didn't move, neither did I, for a long while. The morning of the review, the concourse was already full when I walked out. Colonists who'd come for the reassurance Drace promised them, 3 squads of armored Corps handlers standing in a loose perimeter, and Pharaoh chained at the center of it under the flat white glare of the dock lights, head low, not fighting the restraints, because fighting had never been the point. Drace stood on the loading ramp above him with a data slate, and the kind of voice that carried without him raising it, explaining to the crowd what an unsanctioned loyalty response was, and why the Corps couldn't tolerate one loose in a population of 11 more just like it. He'd rehearsed the line. I could hear the rehearsal in it. I wasn't supposed to be there. I walked out onto the concourse anyway, past 2 handlers who didn't know what to do with an unarmed kennel tech ignoring a live termination order, and I stood next to Pharaoh. Not in front of him. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I've never been the sort. Just next to him, the way I always stood at the gate. Easy, I said. Same word I always used. I'm right here. Pharaoh's head came up off the ground for the first time since the chains went on. And then he did something I'd genuinely never seen him do in 6 years. He shifted his whole armored bulk sideways, unhurried, until he was standing between me and the strike line. Not aggressive, not snarling, just there, immovable. A wall of slate-colored plating, with 4 eyes locked on the men holding the guns. Drace's voice cracked, just slightly, over the address system. Stand him down. Nobody moved to obey, not because they were defying the order, because the 10 other hunters chained along the concourse edge, waiting their turn in the review line, had started to move on their own. One by one they broke their handlers' holds, not violently, just a slow, deliberate shrug of restraint, and crossed the deck to sit down beside Pharaoh. Every Apex-class hunter the Corps had bred at Kesh, trained to kill on command, sat in a widening half-circle around one ordinary kennel tech, and the hunter who'd refused to end a friend. The colonists went dead silent. I heard someone's kid ask why the monsters were sitting down, and someone's grandmother answer that they weren't monsters, not anymore. Not that anyone watching could pretend otherwise. Drace stood on that ramp with his data slate and 11 apex predators refusing to look at him, and there wasn't a single order left in his voice that anyone in that crowd was going to follow. He tried twice more. Hold positions. This is a lawful termination review. And both times, his own handlers just stood there, weapons lowered, watching their hunters choose a side that wasn't the Corps'. A Warden-Marshal giving orders nobody obeys, in front of the people he needs to trust him, is not a man who walks off that ramp with his authority intact. He knew it. I could see it happen to his face in real time, the way a held breath finally has to let go. He left the concourse without finishing the review. Nobody stopped him. Nobody needed to. They never formally rescinded the order. Command doesn't like admitting it wrote a bad one. But nobody ever came back to enforce it either. Drace put in for a transfer off Kesh within the season, and the officer who replaced him quietly stopped scheduling public reviews altogether. Pharaoh stayed in the run. Skelt, I heard later, made it to a border colony and stayed there, off every Corps ledger for good. And the settlements he'd shielded put up a plaque with a name on it that wasn't his real designation, because by then, nobody who lived there cared what command had called him. The clerks who kept the Corps' internal reports started calling the whole business the refusal precedent, in that dry official language they use for anything that embarrasses somebody with rank. A phrase meant to sound like doctrine, which is its own kind of joke, because there was no doctrine in it at all. Just 11 hunters who'd decided, on their own, what kind of Corps they were willing to be, and one kennel tech who never once thought he was doing anything worth writing down. I still wheel the cart past Pharaoh's gate twice a day. He still meets me there before it's in sight. I never made him do that. I never made any of them do any of it. That's the part Drace never understood, standing on his ramp with his slate full of protocols. You can breed something to kill on command, arm it, chain it, review it in front of a crowd. You can't order it to love you, and you sure as anything can't order it to stop.